The air hung thick with humidity and unspoken tension as mourners gathered in a quiet Georgia cemetery, the kind where time slows and cicadas buzz like whispers from the past. A line of black cars idled on the gravel road, their windows reflecting the overcast sky as soft gospel music played from a portable speaker. The priest stood at the head of the polished pine casket, Bible in hand, voice steady as he began the final prayers for Thomas Hart, a man many knew but few understood. But before he could finish the last verse, a sharp bark split the silence like a thunderclap. Heads turned. A German shepherd, lean and silent until that moment, broke from the crowd. With lightning precision, he darted past the mourners and hurled himself toward the casket, claws scrambling on the polished grass. Gasps rippled through the crowd as the dog, named Scout, pressed his body against the coffin and let out a low, mournful whine that cut deeper than any eulogy. The priest faltered mid-sentence. A woman clutched her purse to her chest. An old friend of the deceased whispered, "Is that his brother's dog?" But Daniel Hart, standing toward the back in a black suit that didn't quite fit and hands that trembled ever so slightly, said nothing. His eyes were locked on the dog, his dog now, who refused to move, as if anchoring himself to the one truth that hadn't been buried yet. Scout didn't bark again. He just stared at the casket with eyes that didn't flicker, didn't blink, like he was daring the earth itself not to close over something unsaid. "He's grieving," someone murmured, but Daniel wasn't so sure. Scout hadn't made a sound since the day he'd been brought home, silent as a shadow, always watching, always listening. And now, here in the middle of mourning, his voice had returned with purpose. Not sorrow, not confusion, something else. Daniel stepped forward slowly, each crunch of gravel beneath his shoes like a drumbeat to a truth he wasn't ready to face. He crouched beside Scout, placed a hand on his shoulder. "Come on, buddy," he whispered. But Scout didn't budge. His body was stiff, eyes still locked on the box of secrets resting before them. And in that moment, as the clouds parted slightly to let a sliver of sunlight cut through the trees, Daniel felt it deep in his gut, the kind of feeling you don't get from grief, but from knowing. This wasn't just mourning. This was memory. This dog hadn't just lost someone. He'd seen something. Something he wasn't supposed to carry. Something no one else noticed. And as Daniel looked into Scout's eyes, something inside him shifted. Everyone thought it was grief, he would later say, voice heavy with what was to come. But this dog knew something else. Daniel Hart had never liked funerals, not because they made him uncomfortable, but because they always felt too late. At 63, he had buried more than his fair share of students, colleagues, and neighbors during his decades as a high school principal in Dalton County. But this one, the one for his younger brother, Thomas, sat heavy in his chest like wet wool. It wasn't just the casket or the mourners who barely knew him. It was the silence between them, the years that had stretched too far and too long without reconciliation. Thomas had been the wild one, the restless one. They'd grown up in the same modest home with the same Sunday routines and the same strict father, but somewhere in adulthood, Thomas took a turn toward shadows while Daniel stayed with structure. The last time they'd spoken in person had been over a decade ago, 10 terse minutes outside a hospital room, both of them too proud to apologize and too exhausted to fight. And yet, just 2 weeks before his death, Thomas had called. Out of nowhere. His voice was rough, cautious, but clear. "I need a favor." He asked Daniel to come pick up his dog, said he couldn't take care of him anymore. No details. No explanations. Just a name, Scout, and an address tucked deep into the rural backroads of Calhoun County. Daniel didn't ask questions. He just went. When he arrived, Thomas looked thinner than he remembered, older too, like life had burned through him faster than it should have. Scout had been standing by the front porch, silent, still, almost statue-like. "He's a good boy," Thomas had said. Just quiet. Daniel loaded the dog into his truck, not realizing that would be the last time he saw his brother alive. 2 weeks later, Thomas was dead, an apparent stroke, according to the coroner. No foul play suspected. No autopsy requested. The dog had been the only one in the house. The silence since then had been deafening. Scout never barked, never growled. He simply lay by the door most days, alert but unmoving, as if waiting for someone who wasn't coming home. Daniel wasn't used to that kind of quiet. His house had been filled with the echoes of years past. His late wife's humming in the kitchen, the morning rustle of newspapers, the shuffle of his slippers down the hall. Now, the only sound was the occasional creak of old floorboards and Scout's gentle breath. At first, Daniel had assumed the dog was just grieving. Animals did that. He'd seen students break down over goldfish and Labradors with equal sincerity. But the more time passed, the more Daniel sensed that Scout wasn't just sad. He was watching. Not him, but something. Every now and then, the shepherd would stare out the window at nothing in particular, ears twitching, eyes narrowed. It wasn't fear. It was focus. Then came the funeral. The moment when everything changed. When Scout broke his silence with a bark that cracked through the funeral air like lightning. That bark wasn't grief. It wasn't confusion. It was a signal. Something had been set in motion, and Daniel knew it the way you know a storm is coming before the sky even darkens. He didn't know what Thomas had been involved in. He didn't know what kind of life his brother had lived in those last quiet years. But he did know this. Scout had come with answers. Maybe not in words, but in memory, in instinct, in whatever truth the world had tried to bury with Thomas Hart. And Daniel, who had spent his life teaching students how to think critically and read between the lines, suddenly found himself reading his own life like a mystery novel he'd forgotten he was in. The pieces didn't fit. The timeline didn't sit right. And that dog, silent, sharp-eyed, loyal to a ghost, was the only clue that refused to fade. Daniel had no children, no living parents, no one waiting on him to play it safe. And as Scout lay curled on the living room rug, still and watchful, Daniel decided something he hadn't dared to consider in years. He was going to find out the truth. Not for revenge, not even for justice, but for something simpler, for peace, for closure, for a brother he hadn't known how to love, and a dog who wouldn't let him forget that it still mattered. Back at the house, a strange heaviness settled in the air, one Daniel couldn't explain but couldn't ignore. The walls still held the quiet Thomas had left behind, but now there was something else, something unsettled. Scout had been a quiet companion since the day Daniel brought him home, never barking, never demanding. But now, the shepherd's stillness took on a sharper edge. Every time they passed the guest room, the one that had been Thomas's when he'd visited, the one Daniel hadn't dared step into since the funeral, Scout stopped in his tracks. At first, Daniel thought it was reluctance, maybe confusion. But Scout didn't just pause. He bristled. His ears perked, his head lowered, and a low growl rumbled in his chest like thunder deep underground. It wasn't a warning bark. It was something deeper, primal. He wouldn't go near the door. No matter how softly Daniel called or how far he walked inside to show him it was safe, Scout wouldn't cross the threshold. He stood at the doorway like a soldier on the edge of a minefield. Curious, Daniel tried walking the dog past the door while holding the leash, hoping proximity would normalize it. But the moment they reached the frame, Scout planted his feet and refused to move. His body tensed, eyes locked on the closet across the room like it might breathe. It wasn't just fear, it was recognition. Over the next several days, the behavior escalated. Scout began pacing the hallway in slow, deliberate laps. His nails tapped against the old floorboards through the night. He slept with his body pressed flat to the wood, eyes half open, ears twitching. Every now and then, he would stop and simply stare into the guest room's open doorway, motionless except for the steady beat of his breath. Daniel tried everything, blankets, treats, even sleeping with the door closed, but nothing changed. When the door was shut, Scout would sit in front of it and let out the quietest, most haunting whines Daniel had ever heard. It was as if the dog believed someone, or something, was still inside. On the fourth day, as the morning sun streamed through the blinds, Daniel sat on the edge of his recliner and watched Scout with growing unease. The dog had been trained for something, Daniel was sure of it. His alertness wasn't normal house pet behavior. It was the kind of stillness Daniel had seen in search and rescue dogs back when his school had done safety drills with the local fire department. But Thomas had never said anything about Scout's past. Nothing except, "He's a good boy. Just quiet." That phrase came back to Daniel now like an echo. Why so quiet? Why so guarded? With a sigh, Daniel stood and walked down the hallway, Scout following like a shadow. He opened the guest room door fully and stepped inside. The room smelled faintly of cedar and dust. The bed was made. A nightstand held a dusty lamp, a book with a cracked spine, and a single glass that hadn't been used in months. But it was the closet that drew Daniel's eye. More specifically, the way Scout responded to it. The moment Daniel's hand touched the handle, Scout growled low and stepped forward, body tense but controlled. The dog wasn't afraid. He was ready. That closet meant something. Inside, Daniel found a few old shirts, a pair of scuffed boots, and a metal box tucked behind a stack of newspapers. It was locked, heavy, the kind of thing people used to keep secrets, not socks. He brought it out, set it on the bed, and looked at Scout. The dog stared at the box without blinking. "You know what this is, don't you?" Daniel whispered. Scout let out a breath, almost a sigh, and lay down beside the bed, eyes never leaving the box. Daniel retrieved a screwdriver from the kitchen and worked at the hinges until one snapped loose. Inside were papers, some fire department forms, an old photo of a much younger Thomas in front of what looked like a warehouse, and a USB drive taped to the inside lid. There was something else too, a folded note. One sentence, scrawled in hurried ink. "If anything happens to me, follow the dog." Daniel's hands trembled. He sat on the edge of the bed, Scout now resting his chin on his foot. This wasn't just strange behavior. It was a map. A silent trail of breadcrumbs left in fur and instinct. Scout hadn't just been reacting to trauma. He'd been waiting for someone to see what he couldn't say. That night, as Daniel stood at the kitchen sink rinsing out his coffee mug, Scout appeared in the doorway, staring again down the hall. He didn't bark, just stood, unmoving, as if keeping watch. And Daniel realized, with the kind of certainty that roots itself in your bones, that this dog wasn't just guarding a room. He was guarding a memory. One that someone, somewhere, didn't want uncovered. "It's like he's guarding a secret," Daniel muttered to himself. But in the stillness that followed, the air seemed to hum in agreement. Scout blinked slowly, then turned his gaze back toward the door. And Daniel knew it was time to dig deeper. The smell of old wood and oil filled Daniel's nostrils as he stepped into the detached garage, the kind his father had built by hand decades ago. A place where memories hung like dust in the air, too stubborn to sweep away. The rafters creaked above, the light flickered overhead, and somewhere in the stillness, Daniel felt the ghost of his brother walking beside him. He hadn't meant to come out here, not really. It had just started with needing air, needing space, but something, instinct maybe, or the same sense Scout had been following, had led him here. The garage had been untouched since Thomas died, its shelves cluttered with old fishing rods, a broken vice grip, and neatly stacked boxes labeled in Thomas's jagged handwriting. Daniel opened the first one and froze. Inside were photos, not of family or childhood, but surveillance-style shots of men in suits, alleyway exchanges, and faded documents marked with fire department insignias. One picture showed a man Daniel vaguely remembered from a city council photo, standing beside an unmarked van. Thomas's life hadn't been paranoid fiction. It was documented obsession. And Daniel didn't know if that made things better or worse. A gust of wind rattled the garage door just as Daniel reached into a rusted coffee tin near the back shelf. Inside, under some receipts and washers, was a folded piece of paper, its edges burned, the ink smudged as if time had tried to erase it. The smell of smoke lingered faintly. He carefully unfolded it, the paper crackling like it still held heat. The letter was short, frantic in tone, and written in Thomas's unmistakable hand. "They know about the dog. It wasn't an accident. If you're reading this, it means I failed. Tell Daniel I'm sorry. I never stopped watching. I never stopped trying." At the bottom, beneath the blackened edge, was a symbol, two overlapping circles with a slash through the middle. No name, no signature. Just the symbol. Daniel stared at it, heart pounding in his chest, unsure what it meant. But Scout knew. The moment Daniel turned to show the paper, Scout stiffened, his ears erect, eyes locked on the paper like it was a weapon. Then, to Daniel's astonishment, the dog growled, not a soft, uncertain rumble, but a deep, protective sound, his body rising slowly to full alert. "You've seen this before," Daniel whispered. Scout stepped closer, nose twitching, gaze never breaking from the mark. Daniel turned the paper back around and studied it again. The symbol meant something. Not just to Thomas, but to Scout. This wasn't a random letter. It was a trigger, a warning encoded in whatever twisted part of Thomas's world had followed him to the grave. As Daniel sat down on an overturned crate, the past rolled over him like fog, thick and unrelenting. He remembered Thomas at 17, restless, angry, always looking over his shoulder. He remembered the first time his brother had disappeared for weeks, then reappeared thin, hollow-eyed, refusing to talk. Their parents had chalked it up to just a phase, but Daniel had known better. Thomas had secrets even back then. When their mother died, Thomas hadn't come home. When Daniel married and tried to build something stable, Thomas drifted further into obscurity. By the time Daniel retired from the school system, he barely knew where his brother lived. But now, with this letter and this dog, the story of Thomas Hart was unraveling, and it was far darker than Daniel had ever imagined. Scout stood now near the door of the garage, eyes fixed outside as if anticipating someone. Daniel tucked the letter into his jacket pocket, the corners still warm against his chest. He stood slowly, his joints stiff but mind alert. "You knew something, didn't you?" he said to Scout. "Something they didn't want you to remember." Scout didn't react, but his tail gave the smallest twitch, not in happiness, but readiness. Like he, too, had just remembered something important. Daniel glanced back at the garage, at the chaos of Thomas's secrets packed into dusty boxes and rusted tins. He had spent his life trying to make sense of teenagers' stories, guiding broken minds toward something better. But he'd missed his own brother's silent cry for help. Maybe it wasn't too late to listen now. Maybe Scout was the last voice Thomas had left behind. As Daniel walked back toward the house, the wind picked up again, scattering dry leaves across the yard. He reached for the door handle, then paused, pulling the letter out one more time. The overlapping circles. The slash. A code, a symbol, something Thomas had been watching, fearing. The phrase came back to him, "They know about the dog." That meant Scout had seen something, remembered something, and someone else knew it. Daniel looked down at the shepherd, whose eyes burned with silent loyalty. "You're not just protecting me," Daniel whispered. "You're finishing what he started." The air was heavy with late autumn stillness, the kind that made every leaf crunch sound like a whisper and every gust of wind feel like it carried a message. Scout had been restless since the garage discovery, tail stiff, body tense, ears on constant alert. Daniel had taken to watching him closely now, not just as a pet, but as a partner, one with a buried story in his bones. That morning, Scout stood at the back door staring at the old shed that sat like a forgotten monument at the edge of the yard. The structure was warped and leaning, half swallowed by kudzu vines and shadowed by the thick pines that bordered the property. Daniel had barely stepped near it in years, but Scout's gaze was locked on it. Not the shed itself, but just behind it. Daniel opened the door, and Scout darted out, heading not to his usual spot near the porch but straight for the base of the shed's rear wall. He sniffed the ground, circled twice, then began pawing at a patch of dirt near the rotting foundation. Daniel followed slowly, heart beginning to thrum. "What is it, boy?" he asked, crouching beside him. Scout kept digging. His paws were fast but careful, like this was muscle memory. Within minutes, the tip of something metallic peeked through the loosened soil. Daniel brushed the dirt aside, revealing the edge of a rusted metal container, small, square, and clearly meant to be hidden. It wasn't a simple toolbox. It was a safe. The lock had corroded, but with a flathead screwdriver and some old persistence, Daniel pried it open. Inside was a manila folder sealed in a plastic zip bag, and a heavy object wrapped in a military-style cleaning cloth. He unfolded the cloth slowly, and what tumbled into his palms stole the breath from his lungs. A genuine fire department badge, dulled by time but unmistakably real. Engine 12. Atlanta Fire Division. Thomas's name wasn't on it, but it was his handwriting scrawled on a sticky note tucked behind it. "Don't trust the official story." Daniel stared at the badge, his mind spinning. Thomas had never been a firefighter. He'd never even expressed interest in civil service. So why did he have this? And why had he hidden it like it was evidence? Beneath the cloth, Daniel found a clipping from the Atlanta Tribune, dated March 1997. The headline read, "3 firefighters die in warehouse blaze, cause listed as accidental." The photo beneath it showed black smoke pouring from a collapsing roof, fire crews struggling against the inferno. The article was heavily marked with red circles and arrows, names, dates, lines scribbled out. The victims were listed: Captain Roy Demps, Lieutenant Peter Nash, and an unidentified third body burned beyond recognition. At the bottom of the article, a small handwritten note read, "He saw what they were doing. He never made it out." Daniel's stomach turned. Scout sat beside him now, tail resting gently against Daniel's boot, eyes fixed on the badge in his hand. "You were there," Daniel murmured, barely able to speak the words. "Weren't you?" It hit him like a wave. The scars on Scout's body, the way he responded to sirens, his instinctive protectiveness, the way he growled at certain people, places, sounds. It wasn't trauma from abuse. It was memory, lived experience. This dog wasn't just witness to a crime. He had survived one. Daniel spread the documents on the ground like puzzle pieces. One was a floor plan of the burned warehouse. Another was a handwritten list of names, most crossed out. And then, at the bottom of the safe, folded so many times the creases had nearly disintegrated the paper, was a note written entirely in capital letters. "Scout is the last one who knows. If they find him first, they'll bury the truth for good." Daniel read it twice, then a third time, his fingers tightening. The cold truth was settling into his bones now. Someone had died for this. Maybe several people. And his brother, paranoid and distant, hadn't been crazy. He'd been hunted. Scout stirred beside him and nudged the badge with his nose. Daniel exhaled shakily. This wasn't just about Thomas anymore. It was about unfinished business, a story smothered in smoke and silence. "All right," Daniel said quietly, pocketing the clipping and badge. "Let's find out what really happened in '97. Scout gave a low grunt, an affirmation, not a growl. They stood together in the fading light, Two unlikely survivors tethered by loss and the unshakable scent of something still very, very wrong. The firehouse still smelled like ash and diesel, even decades after Daniel had last set foot in one. The receptionist behind the glass pane barely looked up as he entered, just slid a clipboard through the opening and told him, flatly, that public archives were limited to names, badge numbers, and service years. No narrative reports, no personnel files, no incident details without a court order, she said, barely looking up from her computer. Daniel nodded, filled out the form, and sat on a bench that creaked beneath his weight. Scout sat beside him, tail curled around his legs, posture alert. It had taken nearly an hour of coaxing to get the shepherd into the car that morning. Ever since the documents were uncovered behind the shed, Scout had been edgy, jumping at the faintest crackle, retreating from the sound of distant sirens, pacing whenever Daniel turned on the television. And yet now, inside this place of polished boots and yellow helmets, he was deadly still, eyes trained on the glass doors like a soldier watching the tree line for movement. Daniel's name was eventually called, and he followed a young clerk into a records room lined with filing cabinets and outdated monitors. The boy, barely 20, tapped at a keyboard and frowned. "You said the name was Thomas Hart?" he asked, repeating it twice. Daniel nodded. "He would have had something to do with Engine 12 around 97. I found a badge with that number." The boy shook his head slowly. "There's no record of any Thomas Hart serving in the department. Not as firefighter, not admin, nothing." Daniel's stomach sank, but he kept his voice level. "Was there a fire that year? A warehouse blaze?" The boy nodded, turning the monitor so Daniel could see the summary. 3 men dead. 1 unidentified. Cause? Arson. Investigation? Closed. Daniel stared at the screen, heart thumping. "Unidentified?" he asked. "They never figured out who?" The boy shrugged. "Bodies were too badly burned. Back then, they didn't have DNA tech like now. Unless someone claimed it, they just buried him under a number." Scout let out a low sound beside him, half growl, half whine, and Daniel laid a hand on the dog's head. The boy seemed uneasy now. "Why are you looking into this?" he asked. "No offense, sir, but if your brother's name's not even here—" "He was involved," Daniel said simply. "He just wasn't supposed to be." As they left the station, Daniel's thoughts swirled. The badge wasn't fake. The safe behind the shed. The letter. All of it pointed to one thing. Thomas had been somewhere he wasn't meant to be in 1997. But what? And why would someone go to such lengths to erase that? At home, Daniel sat with the folder on the kitchen table, flipping through the yellowed articles and notes again. Scout lay beneath the table, still and silent. The news played in the background, something about a city development project, and Daniel wasn't even listening until he heard a voice, a deep, gravelly baritone, and Scout snapped to attention. He didn't bark. He growled. Low and dangerous. Daniel turned to the screen. The speaker was a man in a suit, silver hair, clean cut, a sharp stare that made you feel cornered even through the screen. Councilman Everett Lowe. A name Daniel barely recognized. But Scout knew it. He growled louder, his body rising, hackles stiff. "You know him?" Daniel asked softly. Scout stepped toward the screen, teeth barely bared. And Daniel's stomach turned. He rewound the segment. Played it again. The same reaction. The same growl. This wasn't coincidence. Daniel scribbled the name down, opened his laptop, and started searching. Councilman Lowe had been a fire inspector in the late 90s, before turning to politics. He'd been on site during the 1997 warehouse blaze. Promoted shortly after. And now, 2 decades later, he was backing a real estate proposal to level several aging industrial zones, including the area near the old warehouse site. You weren't just at the fire. Daniel whispered to the screen. You benefited from it. It was late in the evening when Daniel drove to a small house tucked behind the church district. Brick, small porch, white mailbox. He'd found the address buried in a forgotten firefighter blog, a list of retired marshals who still volunteered during Fire Safety Week. The man who answered the door had cloudy eyes and a back brace, but his handshake was firm. You Daniel Hart? He asked. Been expecting you. Come in. The house was warm, cluttered, the walls covered in plaques and faded photos. A younger version of the man stood proudly beside a fire truck in most of them. Name's Ernie Clevin, he said, offering tea. Used to be state fire marshal. Retired in '03. Daniel pulled out the badge. Do you remember this? Ernie stared. His jaw tightened. He didn't touch it. Engine 12, he said slowly. I remember that fire. Warehouse on Shady Grove. Hottest thing I've ever seen. 3 men dead. One we never identified. But we had a guess. Thomas Hart, Daniel said. Ernie looked at him, long and slow. You his brother? Daniel nodded. He's dead now. But I think he knew something about that fire. And I think someone didn't want him talking. Ernie didn't speak for a long time. Then finally he said, that warehouse, it was a front. You understand me? Storage for sensitive materials, unregulated, undocumented. Certain folks didn't want inspectors sniffing around. That third body? We suspected it was someone trying to blow the whistle. But then reports were sealed. Investigators reassigned. And men like Everett Lowe got promoted fast. Daniel leaned forward. Why hasn't this come out? Ernie laughed bitterly. Because the fire burned all the proof. Except maybe that dog of yours. Scout, who had been quiet until now, gave a soft bark. Not angry, aware. Listen to me, Ernie said, suddenly serious. Whatever your brother knew, whatever he left behind, you're stirring it up now. And men like Lowe? They don't like old ghosts coming back. Daniel stood. So what should I do? Pretend it didn't happen? Ernie sighed. I'm saying that be careful. Your brother was chasing something he never caught. Don't let it swallow you too. As Daniel left the house, Scout at his side, he knew something with absolute clarity. This wasn't just a memory. It was a fuse. And it was already burning. The examination room was quiet except for the soft buzz of fluorescent lights overhead and the occasional metallic clink of tools on a tray. Scout sat on the table, stoic but tense, his eyes tracking every move the vet made. Dr. Maddie Reynolds, a kind-eyed woman with 2 decades of field experience, moved with the gentle confidence of someone who'd seen every kind of injury a dog could carry, until now. Daniel sat just a few feet away, his fingers locked, anxiety curling around his gut like smoke. He'd brought Scout in under the pretense of a routine checkup, but deep down he knew this visit wasn't routine. Not after everything they'd uncovered. Not after the way Scout reacted to sirens, certain voices, the mention of names from a fire long buried in official silence. Maddie adjusted her glasses and tilted Scout's body slightly to examine an old scar near his ribcage. These injuries, she said softly, tracing a finger along the mottled skin beneath the fur. They're old. Healed but deep. Look here. See this patch along his flank? That's a 2nd-degree burn. Probably chemical. And this, she turned his leg gently, revealing an uneven area near the joint. That's an old fracture. And not from a car or rough play. It was crushed. Possibly under something heavy. Daniel swallowed. His throat was dry. Could it be from abuse? He asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Maddie paused. It's possible. But more likely, trauma from a structural collapse, maybe a fire. These kinds of injuries, they're not common in household pets. Daniel's heart sank. Scout sat still, as if he understood every word. His ears flicked slightly when Maddie mentioned fire. "You're saying he's been through something serious?" Daniel asked. Maddie nodded. "More than once, I'd guess. Multiple layers of scarring. Some of these wounds were left untreated for a long time. But he survived. That tells me he wasn't just any dog. He was trained, conditioned, and lucky." Daniel stared at the floor, his thoughts spiraling. The warehouse fire. The third unidentified body. The badge in the box. The newspaper clippings. And now this. Scout hadn't come into Thomas's life after the danger. He had come from it. And somehow, he had survived it when others hadn't. The timeline made sense now. The dog didn't bark at danger, he read it. Reacted to it with the kind of awareness only born from experience. He didn't just remember. He had lived it. "This wasn't just a pet," Daniel murmured. "This was a witness." Scout looked at him then, a slow blink, the kind that lingered with emotion far deeper than instinct. Maddie raised her brow. "You know something about this, don't you?" Daniel hesitated, then nodded. "More every day. And it's scaring the hell out of me." On the way home, the sky was heavy with clouds, the wind sharp against the windshield as Daniel drove in silence. Scout lay curled in the back seat, not asleep, watching. Always watching. Daniel's hands gripped the wheel tighter than usual, his mind racing through every detail they'd uncovered. The warehouse fire, the missing names, the badge that didn't belong to a firefighter, the box hidden behind the shed, and now, burns on the dog that placed him inside the fire itself. Scout had been there. He had smelled the smoke, heard the screams, survived the collapse. Maybe he had even tried to save someone. And then someone had tried to erase him. But Thomas hadn't let that happen. Somehow, he had taken the dog in, protected him, hidden him. But why hadn't he said anything to Daniel? Why the cryptic notes, the buried clues? Was it guilt? Fear? Or something more dangerous? Something Thomas knew could still hurt people, even years later? As Daniel pulled into the driveway, he looked at Scout in the rearview mirror. "You remember everything," he said softly. "Don't you, boy?" Scout held his gaze through the glass, steady, unwavering. And in that unspoken moment, Daniel no longer saw a dog. He saw a survivor. A silent soldier who had carried a truth so terrible, no one had dared to believe it. Until now. The clinic smelled faintly of antiseptic and cedar shavings, clean but clinical, yet the tension that hung in the air was anything but routine. Scout sat rigid on the elevated table, his muscles taut beneath his thick coat, but he didn't flinch. He never did. Dr. Maddie Reynolds, a seasoned veterinarian with calm eyes and steady hands, moved slowly, her gloved fingers tracing along the dog's torso with the practiced delicacy of someone who'd spent years understanding the language of pain animals couldn't speak. Daniel sat nearby, silent, watching every flicker of her expression. He hadn't told her everything, only that Scout had a history he didn't fully understand and had been reacting strangely to certain sounds and places. He didn't mention the fire, or the file hidden behind the shed, or the body buried in the past. But he didn't need to. Maddie paused, gently parting the fur near Scout's ribcage, and her breath caught. "This is a burn scar," she said quietly. "Second degree at least. Judging by the scarring, it's old. Maybe 15, 20 years. She looked up, brow furrowed. "Did he come from a shelter?" Daniel nodded slowly. "From my brother. Just before my brother died." Maddie continued her examination, carefully rotating Scout's hind leg. "This fracture here," she murmured, "was never properly set. He was either trapped or crushed under something. Not a car. A collapse, maybe." She moved to his shoulders, noting another healed over welt, long and shallow like something had scraped a long bone. And here, she added, this is blunt force trauma. Not fresh, but significant. Daniel's throat tightened. Scout remained silent the entire time, his gaze fixed on the door like he was waiting for someone or remembering someone. He's seen something, Maddie finally said. He's survived something. This isn't the kind of damage you see from regular abuse. These are tactical injuries. Burns, broken bones, untreated wounds. This dog was caught in something dangerous, something prolonged. He wasn't rescued, he escaped. Daniel looked down at Scout, whose eyes still held that same calm, unreadable depth. Do you think he was in a fire? Maddie nodded, almost certain. Not just in it, right at the heart of it. His lungs are strong, which means he wasn't in enclosed smoke for long. But the pattern of scarring, he didn't just pass by a fire. He was moving through it, working maybe. Daniel's jaw clenched. He wasn't just a dog, he whispered. He was trained, used, left behind. He told her then, briefly, about the warehouse fire in 1997, about the unclaimed body, the badge that didn't belong to a real firefighter, the hidden files. Maddie listened in silence, her hand resting lightly on Scout's back. When he finished, she sighed and leaned against the counter. Then this dog is a witness. And someone made damn sure no one listened to him. On the drive home, Daniel couldn't speak. The wind howled gently against the window, but inside the cab, it was Scout's breathing that kept him grounded. The dog didn't sleep, just stared out at the road with soldier-still focus. He had come through fire once, maybe more than once, and he had been carrying the story in his bones ever since. As they pulled into the driveway, Daniel's eyes were glassy. He didn't think of Scout as an animal anymore. He was memory wrapped in fur, proof of something buried long ago. And that made him dangerous to the people who wanted it all forgotten. The town of Ashgrove had always seemed too small for secrets, but Daniel knew better now. And so did Scout. In the days that followed the vet visit and the flash drive's discovery, the dog's behavior shifted from quietly haunted to unmistakably purposeful. He didn't just follow Daniel around the house anymore. He monitored windows, stopped at corners, froze at certain voices on the radio. Most notably, he reacted when Councilman Everett Lowe's face appeared during a televised town meeting, snarling low, tail stiff, body leaning forward like he was ready to lunge through the screen. At first, Daniel dismissed it as coincidence, but when it happened again on Main Street, Scout suddenly growling as they passed Deputy Kincaid standing outside the diner, Daniel stopped walking. The dog's body was rigid, his eyes fixed on the man in uniform, and the moment Kincaid noticed, his smile faltered. "What's with the mutt?" he asked casually, but Daniel saw the flicker of unease behind the badge. "He remembers things," Daniel replied coolly, and they walked away. That evening, Daniel decided he'd had enough. He went to Councilman Lowe's office, stood at the receptionist's desk and asked for 5 minutes. He was told the councilman was unavailable. Daniel didn't leave. Not until Lowe came out of the back room and saw him, froze, then forced a tight smile. "Mr. Hart," he said, "we're not open to walk-ins today." "I think you know my brother," Daniel replied. "Thomas Hart. Died a few weeks ago." "But I don't think you ever believed in natural causes." Lowe's face tightened. "I'm sorry for your loss." "Are you?" Daniel asked. "Because he left a lot of things behind. Files, photos, voice recordings, and a dog that can't forget what you sound like." Lowe's smile dropped. "Be careful what you dig up, Mr. Hart. You might not like what's buried." Daniel left without another word, but something about that encounter felt final, like a line had been crossed. That night, Long after the porch light had gone out and Daniel lay in bed with Scout curled at the foot of it, a sound broke the silence. A faint clink. Then glass shattering. The back window. Scout launched from the bed before Daniel could sit up. A shadow moved through the hallway, heavy boots creaking the floor. Daniel grabbed the old Louisville Slugger from beneath his bed, heart racing. Scout's bark exploded through the house, feral, furious, not like anything Daniel had heard before. A snarl followed, then a loud crash. Daniel sprinted to the kitchen in time to see a figure dressed in dark clothes fleeing out the side door, Scout hot on his heels. Daniel followed barefoot, the bat in hand, but couldn't keep up. Scout tore across the yard, into the trees, his barks echoing in the night like gunfire. A few minutes later, there was silence. Daniel stood at the edge of the woods, heart pounding, waiting. Movement. Scout returned from the darkness, alone, blood on his paws but not limping. He walked to Daniel slowly, calmly, as if to say, he won't be back tonight. Daniel dropped to his knees, hugging him tightly. "You saved me," he whispered, "just like you did for Thomas." The next morning, word had already spread. The neighbor's security camera had caught part of the chase, and a local blogger posted the footage with a headline that began to make its rounds. "Was this dog trying to warn us?" By noon, a small crew from Channel 6 News stood outside Daniel's fence, asking questions. Scout sat beside him on the porch, calm and regal as the camera rolled. "What do you think he was protecting?" the reporter asked. Daniel looked down at the dog and smiled faintly. "The truth," he said. "Something people stopped listening to a long time ago." Inside, his brother's flash drive sat in a drawer. And somewhere in the woods was a man who now knew. This dog remembered everything. The town hall was never meant for moments like this. The polished oak podium, the folding chairs with worn edges, the American flag gently swaying in the still air, it had always hosted bake sales, school board complaints, zoning debates. But tonight, it brimmed with something heavier, reckoning. Word had spread fast since the break-in and the Channel 6 News coverage. Now the seats were filled with familiar faces Daniel had seen all his life: grocery clerks, teachers, former students, firefighters, city clerks, most wearing expressions that hovered between disbelief and raw concern. At the front, beside Daniel's chair, Scout lay like a sentinel, steady, as if he knew the weight of the moment better than anyone else in the room. Daniel stood slowly, placing a small flash drive on the podium. A single projector screen had been rolled down behind him, flickering softly with the first slide. A photo of Scout, years younger, eyes sharp, vest tight around his chest. "My name is Daniel Hart," he began, voice carrying through the silence, "and I'm here because my brother was never meant to be a hero. But he became one. And then he was erased." Gasps murmured softly as the screen shifted. Voice memos, construction schematics, pictures of Councilman Everett Lowe in nighttime meetings, building blueprints marked with red excess. "Thomas Hart lived alone for most of his life," Daniel continued. "He didn't trust people, not because he was paranoid, but because people he tried to trust betrayed him. And when he uncovered the truth behind the 1997 warehouse fire, the fire that killed 3 men and buried the name of a 4th, he knew no one would believe him. Except one soul did." He gestured down toward Scout, who didn't flinch as dozens of eyes turned toward him. "This dog," Daniel said, his voice tightening with emotion, "was with Thomas through everything. He survived the same fire. He wore a vest. He was trained. He saw it all. And when Thomas died, when someone made it look natural, this dog didn't forget. He tried to tell us. Again and again." Murmurs swept through the crowd, followed by one voice near the front. Mrs. Kinney, a retired librarian. "That's the dog who chased off the intruder, right?" Daniel nodded. "Yes." He saved me too. Because Scout doesn't give up. He remembers. And now he's made sure we remember. He loaded a short video, Thomas's final voice memo. The room fell still. Thomas's voice, scratchy and weary, spilled from the speakers. If you're hearing this, they got me. But if this dog's still alive, you've still got proof. Protect him. Believe him. He's the last one who knows what really happened. A collective hush wrapped around the room like a fog. Daniel leaned forward, both hands gripping the podium. I don't want vengeance. I want truth. My brother died trying to bring light to this. Scout almost died protecting it. I don't care if it's been 2 decades. We deserve the truth. And so do the families of those who burned in that warehouse. The silence broke into scattered claps, then a rising chorus of applause, raw, emotional, not out of ceremony, but conviction. By the time Daniel stepped away from the podium, the town's district attorney, who had been sitting in the back row, was already on the phone. An emergency council meeting was called for the following morning. The mayor promised transparency, and the name Everett Lowe, once untouchable, was now paired with words like investigation, suspension, and evidence review. Daniel sat down beside Scout and exhaled for the first time in hours. The dog pressed his body gently against his leg. No bark, no whimper, just presence. As the crowd slowly filtered out, a boy no older than 10 approached quietly and knelt to pet Scout. He's a good dog, the boy said. Daniel smiled, eyes damp. He's the reason we're all here. Then he looked at the ceiling and whispered, as if to his brother, You didn't die forgotten, Thomas. He made sure of that. The warehouse was gone now, razed down to a concrete scar and the echoes of a past that refused to die quietly. In its place, a quiet memorial rose, a bronze plaque flanked by 2 trees, and a low stone wall inscribed with names once lost to the fire's smoke. Among them now was a 4th name, Thomas Hart. Posthumously exonerated, officially recognized not as a recluse or a paranoid conspiracy theorist, but as a whistleblower who risked everything to expose corruption and failed only because the world wasn't ready to listen. Daniel stood before the plaque on dedication day, the autumn wind whispering through the branches, Scout seated at his side in a new harness polished with care. People gathered in small, respectful clusters, families of the fallen, retired firefighters, students with cameras. When the county commissioner took the microphone, her voice wavered slightly. Today, we honor those we failed to protect, and we correct what should have never been buried. Thomas Hart uncovered a truth that cost him everything, but he didn't walk through that fire alone. She turned, kneeling beside Scout, and held out a blue box with a velvet interior. Inside was a silver medal etched with a simple phrase, Valor in Silence. The dog didn't flinch. He simply stared forward, proud and still. Cameras clicked. Applause rose, not loud, but reverent. Daniel blinked hard, laying a hand gently on Scout's back. He couldn't speak, he whispered, but he never stopped telling the truth. Weeks later, Daniel and Scout stood on stage at a first responders remembrance event hosted by the state. The hall was packed, uniforms everywhere, ribbons, polished boots, and flags. Daniel looked out over the crowd of stoic faces and began with a story not about his brother, but about a dog. He came to me with no bark, no trust, and no name. My brother had called him Scout, but I didn't understand why until I realized he was always watching, always protecting. Not just my brother, but the truth itself. He remembered what others forgot. And when no one else could speak for justice, he chased it down in the dark. Scout stood beside him, wearing the medal, tail still, ears up. No movement, just presence. It was enough. The applause that followed shook Daniel to his core, not because it was loud, but because it was unanimous. From strangers, officers, EMTs, veterans. They weren't clapping for a speech. They were clapping for a story finally heard. For a man once called crazy, and a dog who refused to forget. That night, back at home, Daniel placed the medal in a shadow box beside Thomas's photo. Then he leaned down to Scout and kissed the top of his head. "You're not just a dog," he murmured. "You're a promise kept." The porch light glowed warm against the soft dusk, casting long shadows that stretched down the wooden steps and faded into the quiet gravel road below. Daniel sat in the old rocking chair, its joints creaking gently with each sway, the familiar rhythm a comfort he hadn't felt in years. Next to him lay Scout, stretched out with his head resting near Daniel's boot, his eyes half-lidded but never fully asleep, always listening, always aware. The town lay below them like a sleeping photograph, amber street lamps blinking on one by one, distant laughter drifting up from the corner store where teens lingered on skateboards and soda cans clinked like memories. It had been 3 months since the ceremony. 3 months since the name Thomas Hart was etched into public record not as a suspect, but as a man who'd tried to do right. 3 months since Scout had stood on a stage and reminded an entire county that silence didn't mean surrender. And tonight, there was no noise, no crowd, no danger, just a porch, a dog, and a man who'd learned the hardest truths in the most unexpected ways. Daniel looked down at Scout and smiled, a tired, grateful kind of smile that softened his weathered face. "I thought I rescued you," he whispered, his voice catching slightly in his throat. "But really, Scout, you rescued us?" The dog's tail thumped once, just enough to show he'd heard and understood. The wind carried the faint scent of pine and distant smoke, not the choking kind, but the kind that came from fireplaces and comfort. Daniel leaned back, hands behind his head, staring up at the stars as they began to blink into place one by one. The world felt wider now, somehow. Not just because secrets had been exposed or justice had finally found breath, but because something unspoken had healed inside him. It wasn't about closure, it was about continuity. Scout had not only uncovered truth, he had reminded Daniel that even in loss, there can be legacy. Even in silence, there can be signal. And even a dog once broken by fire can become a light on a porch in a quiet town, guarding not just a man, but a memory. No speeches tonight. No medals. Just breath and peace and the soft hum of crickets under a sky that had watched it all unfold. Scout shifted slightly and let out a low, contented sigh as he nestled closer to Daniel's feet. And for the first time in a long time, Daniel didn't feel the need to look back. Everything that mattered was right there with him. In fur, in silence, in the promise of one more morning. Dogs don't speak, but they remember. They grieve in silence, stand guard when no one's watching, and sometimes, in ways we don't fully understand, they bring justice. Scout never said a word, but he carried a truth that outlasted betrayal, fire, and silence. He didn't just protect Thomas. He preserved the memory of a man who died doing what was right. And in doing so, Scout reminded all of us that some voices don't need sound to be heard. As Daniel sits beside him on that quiet porch, the world turning slow in gold around them, the story lingers far beyond their town. Because Scout's story isn't just his. It belongs to every silent witness, every unrecognized hero with paws and scars, every dog that's given everything and asked for nothing. Across the country, there are retired K9s whose lives end in kennels, their service forgotten the moment their badge is removed. There are handlers carrying invisible wounds, haunted by things they can't explain, bonded to partners who saved them in ways no human ever could. To honor them is more than charity, it's duty. Scout's journey calls us to act, to support programs for retired service dogs, to advocate for the mental health of first responders, to recognize the stories written in fur and silence. Because justice doesn't always wear a robe, and love doesn't always speak aloud. Sometimes it barks. Sometimes it waits by the door. Sometimes it drags us from the fire, then curls up at our feet as if nothing happened. And when the world fades to black and the screen dims, let the final image be this: a man and his dog under the stars, one heart still healing, the other having never given up. Scout didn't just tell a story, he lived one. And through him, we are reminded the quietest souls often leave the loudest legacy.